I don't know how to thank you. I don't think there are words for what you did. The old woman standing in the doorway of the clinic was named Harriet Pell, and she was 72 years old, and she had been coming to this small room on Dunmore Street for 3 years for her blood pressure checks and her arthritis management, and the occasional afternoon when what she really needed was someone to sit with her for a few minutes, while the world outside felt too large and too indifferent. She was holding a loaf of bread wrapped in a dish towel, which she had brought because she had made 2 loaves that morning and had no use for the second one, and because she understood, in the way of women who have lived long enough to see the difference between gestures that mean something and gestures that don't, that bringing a person bread on the day they are losing something was the correct thing to do. Dr. Senna Voss stood at the door of the clinic she was in the process of closing, and she accepted the bread with both hands, and she did not cry, because she had been not crying all morning through a considerable internal effort, and she was not going to stop now. "You don't owe me anything, Harriet," she said. "You never did." "I know that," Harriet said firmly. "That's the point." She pressed Senna's hand once, briefly, with the warm grip of a woman who means it, and then she turned and walked slowly down the 3 steps to the sidewalk, and Senna watched her go and stood in the open door of her clinic for a moment before going back inside. The clinic at 14 Dunmore Street was not large. It had never been large. It occupied the ground floor of a building that had previously been a small insurance office, and it had a waiting room that fit 6 chairs comfortably, and 8 if you moved them, and an examination room with a table and a cabinet and a standing lamp that Senna had bought second-hand and repaired herself, and a small desk area where she kept her files in labeled folders because she had never been able to afford a digital management system that worked reliably, and a bathroom that had a crack in the tile above the sink that she had been meaning to fix for 2 years and now would not need to. She had treated patients here for 4 years. She had treated them for free or for whatever they could manage, which was sometimes nothing and sometimes a small amount and sometimes, like Harriet, a loaf of bread. She was 28 years old. She had her medical degree from Crestfield University School of Medicine, where she had graduated in the top 10% of her class, and been told by 2 of her clinical supervisors that she had an unusual quality of attention with patients, a quality that was not just diagnostic, but genuinely present, the kind of presence that made patients feel like the only person in the room. She had completed her residency at a mid-sized hospital on the north side of the city and had been offered a position there afterward, a good position with a proper salary and institutional support and the kind of professional trajectory that her medical school classmates had largely taken. She had turned it down. She had taken the lease on the clinic at 14 Dunmore Street, in a neighborhood where the median household income sat well below the city average, where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes on public transit, where the people she saw in the street on her way to work each morning were people who could not afford preventative care, and therefore arrived at emergencies that could have been avoided if someone had been available earlier, more accessibly, with less paperwork attached. Her father, Grover Voss, worked at a mid-sized logistics company, warehouse coordination, 12-hour shifts, the honest and invisible labor that keeps things moving. Her mother, Celestine, ran a small beauty salon from the converted garage of their family home on Aldgate Road. They were not wealthy people. They were people who understood what work cost and what it was for, and they had supported Senna's decision about the clinic with the particular support of parents who do not fully understand a choice, but recognize in it something of their own character and are proud of that. Her father had said the evening she told them about the clinic, "You'll be tired, and you'll be right. Those aren't the same thing, but they're both worth something." She had thought about that sentence on a great number of difficult mornings since. She had been managing the clinic's finances on the edge of solvency for 4 years. She had applied for grants, some of which came through and kept her afloat for months at a time, some of which did not. She had operated on the thinnest possible margins, buying supplies in bulk when she could, repairing equipment herself when it was repairable, keeping staff costs to zero by being her own staff, supplemented on certain days by a rotating group of volunteer medical students from Crestfield who came for the clinical hours and stayed because they found in this small ground floor room on Dunmore Street a quality of medicine that their coursework had described, but that they had not yet seen practiced in full. The financial situation had become unsustainable in the previous 6 months. A grant she had relied on for 2 consecutive years had not been renewed. The building's owner had increased the rent by a figure that was, in the context of the clinic's income, impossible. She had spent 3 months attempting to find an alternative, another grant, another space, a partnership with a larger institution, and had not found one in time. The decision to close had been made 2 weeks ago, and she had spent those 2 weeks telling her regular patients carefully and helping each of them find alternative arrangements, which in most cases meant the 40-minute transit to the hospital that she had known for 4 years was inadequate, and which remained inadequate, and which would become slightly more inadequate with the clinic's closure. She was boxing the last of the medical files when the door opened at 11:47 in the morning. She looked up expecting Harriet again, or perhaps young Marcus Fenn from the 3rd floor, who sometimes brought her coffee on his way to work, and who had been particularly quiet and kind all morning. The man standing in the doorway was not anyone she recognized immediately. He was tall, 33 years old, with the composed and slightly remote quality of someone who has learned to carry a large interior weight without letting it affect his exterior functioning. He was wearing a coat that was understated and expensive in the way of things that don't need to announce their quality. Beside him, holding his hand with both of hers, and looking around the clinic with the wide, absorbing gaze of a 4-year-old cataloging a new environment, was a small girl in a yellow coat. He looked at the boxes, at the bare walls where the posters had already been taken down, at the chair stacks in the waiting area. He took in the sum of it with a single, measured assessment. Then he looked at her. "Tell me the price," he said, "of everything you've done for me." Senna went still. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at patients when she was trying to find something. The face was older than the last time. Of course it was. 5 years had passed. And the composure was more deeply set, the kind of composure that had been constructed rather than natural, built in response to something. But the face was the same. The eyes were the same, dark, steady, working something out. His name was Ledger Crane. He had come to the clinic on a Tuesday evening 5 years ago, not the Dunmore Street clinic, which had not existed yet, but the makeshift walk-in space she had been operating out of a church basement on Fenn Road while she saved for the lease, before the clinic at a proper address or a sign on the door. He had come in the early evening looking like a man who had been ignoring something serious for too long and had arrived at the point where the ignoring was no longer an option. She had diagnosed a severe infection that had progressed farther than it should have, had treated him over 3 visits, had insisted he return for the follow-up, even though he had tried to tell her on the 2nd visit that he was fine. He had recovered fully. He had left after the 3rd visit in the way that some patients left, not rudely, but incompletely, the way people sometimes behave when they have been made vulnerable and do not entirely know what to do with that. He had not paid. She had not asked. She had written his name in her intake notebook, Ledger Crane, the name he had given her, and had thought about him occasionally in the years that followed, the way you think about certain patients who stay with you without your quite knowing why. "I didn't do it for money," she said. He looked at her steadily. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes one in a person who has forgotten how to let them come easily. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." He came inside. The small girl, his daughter, whose name was Linden, and who had her father's steady eyes and a quality of watchful gentleness that Senna recognized immediately as the kind of temperament that develops in children who love a parent who is carrying something heavy, came inside too and immediately became interested in the half-packed box of waiting room toys that Senna had not yet closed. "Can I ask?" he said quietly, looking at the boxes. "Closing," she said, "today, officially." He was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been here?" 4 years. Before this, there was a smaller version in a church basement on Fen Road. That's where she paused. "That's where we met, if you remember." "I remember," he said. "I've been trying to find you for 2 years." She looked at him. "I didn't know your name properly. I knew the street. I went back to Fen Road and the church had changed. I hired someone to search last year, a proper inquiry. They found this address 3 months ago." He paused. "I drove past it twice before I came in. I wasn't sure He stopped. "I wasn't sure it was the right thing." "Why did you come today?" He glanced at the boxes. "I heard from the owner of this building that the clinic was closing. My firm manages properties in this neighborhood. It came through a routine report." He looked back at her. "I came today because if I waited any longer, there wouldn't be anything left to say it to." Senna looked at this man, composed, careful, arriving at the last possible moment with his daughter's hand in his, and felt the specific and complicated emotion of a person who has been seen after a long time of being largely invisible and is not sure what to do with it. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "What I did was what I do. It wasn't a debt." "I know it wasn't," he said. "That's not why I came." He paused, and the pause had a quality of someone preparing to say something that cost them something. "My wife died 14 months after I came to see you on Fen Road. Sudden, an accident. I have spent the last 3 years functioning and not much else." He looked at his daughter, who had found a small wooden puzzle and was examining it with serious concentration. "She is the reason I function, but I have been doing it without," he stopped, searched, "without any sense that what I do matters beyond the immediate." He looked back at Senna. "I have money, significant money. I've built things that employ people and generate returns and occupy my days, and I have not, until recently, thought carefully about what any of it is for." A pause. "I treated you for free in a church basement when I was too proud to acknowledge how sick I was and too disorganized to follow up properly on the payment I owed you. You didn't make me feel like a charity case. You made me feel like a patient. That's a more specific thing than it sounds." Senna listened to all of this with the full attention she gave to everything, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What are you proposing?" she said. "I want to fund the reopening of this clinic," he said, "properly. A proper lease. I own 3 properties within 2 blocks, one of which is larger than this and has been vacant for 8 months. Equipment to clinical standard, a small paid staff so you're not doing this alone, operational costs for a minimum of 3 years while you stabilize." He paused. "I'm not proposing charity. I'm proposing an investment in something I know works, run by someone I know is the right person to run it. I would want no involvement in clinical decisions. That is entirely yours." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about 4 years of grant applications and thin margins and repaired equipment and Harriet's bread. She thought about the 40-minute transit to the hospital and the patients who didn't make it there until things had progressed. She thought about her father's voice, "You'll be tired and you'll be right." She needed to think about it, she said. "I know. That's why I'm not asking for an answer today." He stayed for another 20 minutes, not pressing, not filling the silence with more proposition, simply present in the way of someone who had decided that the right thing to do was to be available rather than persuasive. Linden finished the puzzle and brought it to Senna to show her, and Senna sat on the low chair that was still set up and looked at the completed puzzle with the genuine attention she gave to children. And Linden said, very seriously, "I put the blue piece in wrong the first time, but then I fixed it." And Senna said, "That's actually the best way to learn where the right place is." And Lyndon considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old receiving significant information. Ledger watched this from where he stood near the window. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the specific way of a man who has been observing something for the first time and has recognized in it something he needed to see. They left. He did not ask again. He gave her a card, simple, direct, name and number, and said to call when she was ready, and that there was no urgency in the direction of his preference, only in the direction of the patients who would need somewhere to go. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She spoke to her parents, her father at the kitchen table with his coffee and his measured silences, her mother at the salon counter with her practical and perceptive observations. She spoke to Odette Frayne, who ran the community center 2 blocks from the clinic and who had been sending patients Senna's way for 3 years, and who said, with the directness of someone who had no patience for false modesty, "Senna, there are 64 people who came through that clinic last year who would have gone untreated. Take the money, do the work. Those are the only 2 things that matter." She called Ledger on a Wednesday morning. She told him yes. She told him that she wanted the arrangement documented formally, with clear separation between the funding and the clinical operation, and that she would need his commitment to a non-interference clause in writing. He said those were exactly the terms he had intended to offer. She said she would need 6 months to set up properly before reopening. He said to take the time she needed. The clinic at 22 Dunmore Street, 3 doors down from the original space, in the larger building that Ledger had described, opened on a Thursday in March, 8 months after the closing of the first one. It had 4 examination rooms and a proper waiting area and equipment that worked without needing to be convinced. Senna had hired 2 part-time staff, a medical assistant named Pruitt, who had trained at Crestfield and had been looking for exactly this kind of position, and a part-time administrator named Josephine, who was 60 and retired from hospital administration, and who described the clinic on her first day as the thing I've been looking for since I left. The walls were painted in a warm, calm color that Celestine had chosen on a Saturday morning visit that had turned into a full afternoon, and there was a small corner in the waiting room with low chairs and a basket of books and puzzles for children, which Lyndon had specifically requested after her visit to the old clinic. Ledger came to the opening with Lyndon. He stood at the edge of the room and watched the community come through. Harriet Pell, who arrived first, and sat in the chair nearest the window and looked around with the satisfaction of someone witnessing a right thing being righted. Marcus Fenn from the old building, who had brought coffee for the staff. A young mother named Claudette, who had been coming to Senna since her son was 8 months old and was now pregnant with her second, and who stood in the new waiting room and said quietly, "It's bigger. Good. It should be bigger." Senna stood at the door greeting people, and at some point she looked across the room and found Ledger watching Lyndon, who had gone directly to the children's corner and was already deep in one of the books. His expression was the expression of a man who is beginning, slowly and carefully, to let something back in. Not all the way, not yet, but the door slightly open, the light reaching a few inches further than it had been allowed to reach before. Over the following year, he came to the clinic occasionally, not as a funder checking an investment, but in the way that people come to places that have become meaningful to them without them quite deciding that they would. He brought Lyndon for her vaccinations. He came once for a persistent respiratory issue he had been ignoring, and Senna treated him with the same direct, present attention she gave to everyone. And afterward he said, "You still make people feel like the only person in the room." And she said, "That's the job." And he said, "No, it isn't, not the way you do it." He had begun in the second year after the clinic reopened to reconnect cautiously with his parents, his father, Aldous Crane, with whom he had been estranged for 7 years over a conflict that had long since dissolved into its constituent parts and no longer held its original force.
The reconnection was not dramatic. It was a phone call, and then a visit, and then a second visit during which Lyndon met her grandfather for the first time and climbed into his lap with the uncomplicated confidence of a child who has decided someone is safe. Aldous Crane sat in Ledger's living room with his granddaughter in his lap and did not trust himself to speak for a while, and Ledger sat across from him and let the silence be what it was. Senna had not caused this, but she had, in some indirect way that was difficult to trace precisely but impossible to deny entirely, been part of it, because the qualities she had shown Ledger in a church basement on Fen Road when he was sick and too proud and too disorganized and paying nothing for her care were qualities that he had carried with him, had thought about over the years that followed, and had returned to when he was trying to understand what mattered and what was simply the machinery of getting through days. In the third year of the new clinic, Senna established a community health program, monthly health awareness mornings for local women, free vaccinations for children, a grief support group that met in the waiting room on the first Tuesday of each month, and that Senna attended not as a clinician, but as a person who understood something about sitting with loss. The grief group had been Odette's idea, and Senna had agreed to host it, and on the third meeting, Ledger quietly joined, not speaking much, sitting in the circle with the same composed and careful presence he brought to everything, but there and present, and over the following months, incrementally less defended.
On an evening in the late spring of the clinic's third year, after the last patient had gone and Pruitt had locked up and the building had gone quiet, Senna was at her desk finishing notes when she heard a knock at the internal door. Ledger was standing there with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner. She had mentioned once that it was the best coffee in the neighborhood, and he had remembered with the quiet attentiveness that was, she had come to understand, his primary language of care. He set a cup on her desk and sat in the patient chair across from her, which was a thing he had started doing occasionally at the end of long days, not by arrangement, just when he was nearby and the light was on. "Lyndon asked me today," he said, "what I want to be when I grow up." Senna looked up. "What did he say?" "I said I wasn't sure yet." A pause. She said that was okay because she wasn't sure either, and then she said she thought maybe she wanted to be a doctor because doctors helped people even when they didn't have to. He looked at his coffee cup. "I think she's been listening to you." Senna felt something warm move through her that had no precise name. "She's been listening to you," she said. "You brought her here. You come to the grief group. She paused. "You show up. That's what she's learning." He looked at her across the desk in the quiet of the clinic at the end of a long day and said, "I came to this address on a Tuesday morning 2 years ago, not knowing if I was doing the right thing. I had driven past twice. I wasn't sure." A pause. "I just want to say, I was sure, eventually, that it was right. I should have come sooner. I should have come a long time ago." She looked at him for a moment. "You came when you were ready," she said. "That's how it works." "Is that the medical opinion?" he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost light. "It's the human one," she said. The coffee was good. The evening light was coming through the clinic window in the long April way. Calm, golden, falling on the desk and the chair and the patient file she had been writing in, and the second coffee cup that someone had thought to bring. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what it did at the end of a weekday, returning, slowly, to whatever home meant for each particular person, on each particular evening. In a room on Dunmore Street, 2 people sat with good coffee in a good light, and neither of them rushed the moment, because some moments, when they arrive after a long and difficult passage, deserve to be inhabited fully, not analyzed, not directed, not hurried toward any particular conclusion, just lived quietly in the warmth of what has been built and what is still being built, and what, in all likelihood, will continue. She had saved lives quietly, expecting nothing, and in the end, one life she saved returned the favor, not with payment,
but with trust and presence and the particular grace of someone who had learned through loss and time and the evidence of a small clinic on a quiet street that kindness is not a transaction, it is a direction. And once you find it, the only thing to do is keep walking that way.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, kindness, and love to everyone. Comment below to share your thoughts and be part of spreading positivity in the world.